ages 65 and older have Alzheimer's disease in the United States. And by 2050, it is the trajectory is that about 16 million people will be living with Alzheimer's disease, and it is a very costly disease. It costs $1.1 trillion if we don't do anything about it by 2050. Currently, both direct and indirect costs are about $355 billion, which is astronomical. As far as gender disparities are concerned, 1 in 11 men have the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, and the risk is higher in women, which is 1 in 6. And that has to do with a lot of factors, including menopause, hormonal changes, and also vascular risk factors. Women tend to have different types of vascular risk factors, or they respond differently to uncontrolled vascular risk factors, such as high cholesterol, diabetes, high blood pressure, and things of that nature. And right now in our communities, there are some myths and misunderstandings when it comes to dementia and Alzheimer's in general. The first one is that it can't be prevented, and that can't be further from the truth. And this thought came from some of the older research and the way of thinking about Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Basically, most of the focus was on plaques and tangles, and these are specific types of proteins that are outside or inside the neuron that cause damage, neurodegenerative damage to the brain and its supporting structures. And because the focus were on these plaques and tangles, and once they developed, they didn't go away, it was assumed that this is essentially the disease. But we now know that the picture is more nuanced and it's bigger, and that these processes don't just start all of a sudden at the point of diagnosis, that these changes actually occur very early on, up to 20 to 30 years before the symptoms manifest. And there's a lot we can do to prevent it. We'll talk about that later. The second myth or misunderstanding is that Alzheimer's disease is a purely genetic disease, which means that there are certain genes that you have it, there's really nothing you can do about it, and you'll develop it. And that couldn't be further from the truth. This is a complex diagram, but it kind of shows the different types of genes that are involved in the development of Alzheimer's disease. And when you look at the top part of this particular part of the chart on the x-axis, this is the risk of Alzheimer's disease versus the alleles or the genes. And the ones that have a very high genetic penetrance, which means that if you have these genes, you'll definitely get Alzheimer's disease. Only about 3% of Alzheimer's cases are purely driven by genes, which means only 3% of the cases have the genes and they essentially develop it. The rest of them are not very strong genes. They do increase the risk for Alzheimer's disease, but they're not causative. And when you look at the nature of these genes, these are not Alzheimer's genes per se. These are genes that, say, for example, control cholesterol metabolism, or they control immune response, or they control inflammatory mechanisms. They actually have a lot to do with the epigenetics of Alzheimer's disease, which means the relationship between our lifestyle risk factors, how we live, what we eat, whether we move or not, how we sleep, whether stress affects us or not, and its impact on the brain cells. So if we live a healthy lifestyle, we can keep these genes quiet or quiescent, and they don't really manifest, or they don't really activate certain processes that end up in neurodegeneration. So in many ways, this chart in itself shows us that there's so much that we can do. I'm always jumping to lifestyle because that is the purpose of this talk, but this essentially shows that by modifying our lifestyle, we can control the activation or the deactivation of these genes. The third myth is that there will be only one medication for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And I think this is one of the reasons why we don't have any treatment for Alzheimer's disease up to now. For years and years, scientists have been focusing on amyloid plaques and tangles. We are making some inroads now with some of the newer medications that are coming out, and we're very hopeful that in the next 6 months, we will have more and more information about some of the ones. But so far, we've had failure. There's really no medication for it at all. In this particular chart, you see that the failure rate was 99.6%, but it's 100%. And the medications that in the market available for patients are not disease modifying. They're only symptom modifying. So they improve symptoms for a certain period of time. They really don't reverse the disease at all. So there really won't be only one medication. Because it's a complex disease, we will need multiple medications, or at least a multifaceted approach to managing this disease, and lifestyle is definitely one of them. The last myth and misunderstanding that we want to speak about, there are many more, is that Alzheimer's disease starts with the symptoms of forgetfulness, but it doesn't. There is a very long preclinical phase where people tend to have cognitive decline, as is noted here in this slide. If you see this preclinical phase, people tend to have decline, and some people might even notice it during their lifetime, where they're not as sharp as they used to be, or they don't remember names as much as they did, but they don't really fall into the clinical category of Alzheimer's disease as of yet. And this is the phase that we, Dean and I, are very concerned about, because it's essentially a prodrome to mild cognitive impairment and then dementia. This essentially can be as long as 20 to 30 years. I made the statement earlier, but this can actually be modified, and there's a lot we can do with our lifestyle to change the trajectory and move people towards successful cognitive aging rather than towards mild cognitive impairment and dementia. But thankfully, after decades of research and looking at different observational studies and from multiple different, whether it's anecdotal or long-term observational studies, we now know that lifestyle has a profound effect on reducing dementia. And for the first time in 2019 at the Alzheimer's Association conference, after years and years of scientists saying there's really nothing we can do, there's no treatment for Alzheimer's dementia, there's no prevention as well, there was quite a lot of data showing some effect. And this essentially renewed hope. And Dina and I had been talking about this for a very, very long time. One of the reasons we went to Loma Linda University was to understand the impact of lifestyle on brain health, especially in that population, because they lived the longest. They're one of the longest living populations in the world, as Dan would tell you, as is known in the different blue zones around the world. And when you look at the different factors, lifestyle stands out. It's the lifestyle factors that determines brain health in them. And so this was amazing news, and this actually started more and more work towards understanding lifestyle. Like, for example, in this particular study, they looked at a pool of individuals with the genetic risks for Alzheimer's disease, specifically ApoE4. And when they looked at their risk, it was about 60% higher if they did have the genes. But if the same population had the genetic risk and on top of it lived a very unhealthy lifestyle, their risk shot up to 360%. So they had 360% higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. That's the effect of unhealthy lifestyle on top of bad genes. However, if they lived a healthy lifestyle, but had the genes anyway, their risk fell to less than 30%. That's the impact of lifestyle. I believe this tells us very clearly that adherence to a healthy lifestyle can offset genetic risk. So genes are not destiny. Another study that was conducted in Rush University in two of their population cohorts, the Chicago Health and Aging Project and the Memory and Aging Project, what they did was they created a dementia risk score, which included adherence to the MIND diet, which I'll talk about later, exercise, being physically active, smoking cessation, and cognitive engagement, being mentally active. And they found out that it was not an all or none phenomenon. Every small incremental step of adhering to a lifestyle, a healthy lifestyle factor, really reduced the risk of developing dementia. So as you can see in the leftmost pillar, if they adhere to 0 or 1 risk factor, that was considered as the base, compared to not adhering to any or adhering to 1 risk factor. Those who adhere to 2 or 3 risk lifestyle factors, exercise, nutrition, smoking cessation, cognitive engagement, they reduce their risk of dementia by 37%. But if they adhere to 4 or 5 of these factors, they reduce their risk of dementia by 60%. That's incredible news. And that was the first time that they actually showed this dose-response relationship between lifestyle factors and dementia. So what are some of the risk factors for dementia? From our work and from some of the other works around the world, we've realized that there are basically 4 risk factors. There's oxidation, inflammation, lipid or fat dysregulation in the body, and glucose dysregulation. And how are these managed? Well, these are managed by the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. Things like managing diabetes, things like managing our cholesterol intake, managing our sleep, making sure that we don't get any head traumas, making sure that we don't opt a sedentary behavior and stay active, making sure that we don't smoke, making sure that we're not stressed, making sure that obesity is not an issue in our life. And what are some of the protective factors? The same thing that I just talked about. So when we kind of created this acronym, self-serving acronym, because we're neurologists, we call it neuro. So N is for nutrition, E is for exercise, unwind or stress management, restorative sleep, not just closing your eyes and going to bed, but the kind of sleep that allows you to go through the deeper stages of sleep, because it's important, and optimizing our cognitive activities or staying cognitively active. So the acronym neuro, N-E-U-R-O. Now, just a brief representation of what neuro stands for. N is for nutrition. We all know that food is one of the most important internal environments that we create, and whatever we eat can either protect us from oxidative stress, or it could contribute to the inflammatory damage in the body, whether it's in the brain or any other parts of the body. And we know that inflammation can cause damage to brain cells and lead to brain dysfunction. The focus has been on dietary pattern recently. There's no such thing as superfood. Well, I mean, you could say blueberries is a superfood, which is an amazing food, but we don't eat blueberries only. We eat multiple different types of food. It is the synergy between these foods that matter more than the food itself. So looking at dietary patterns is important, and I'll touch on those. As far as studies are concerned, I could spend the entire day talking to you guys about all of the data that shows that a diet that is plant-based, or at least plant predominant, is very, very healthy, and it definitely reduces the risk for dementia among so many other diseases. But I wanted to kind of pick a couple of studies to show you. This was a study that was done in Loma Linda, Blue Zone, in 1993. They showed that, and as you may know, in Loma Linda, they have a very large population of vegetarians and non-vegetarians. So it's a very good cohort to study the impact of food, and especially a plant-based or a plant-predominant dietary pattern. And back in 1993, they found out that in a group of 3,000 people, those who ate meat, including those who ate poultry and fish, had twice the risk of developing dementia compared to vegetarians. There's so many other studies that show that as well. This is a more recent study that defined the MIND diet, or the Mediterranean intervention for neurodegenerative delay. You got it there. But that was a diet that was created or constructed by Dr. Morris, and it promotes a plant-predominant diet with limited meat and dairy. And when people adhered very well to this dietary pattern, they resulted in a 53% reduction in their risk for Alzheimer's disease. And even moderate adherence reduced their risk for Alzheimer's disease by 35%. And those who had high adherence, listen to this, they had the cognitive functioning equivalent to a person who was 7.5 years younger. The brain looked younger, and it functioned like a younger person as well, which is incredible. Just diet, and it was adjusted for exercise and stress and sleep and things of that nature. So I believe this is a very empowering message. And the Mediterranean diet has been studied quite a bit, and it is a part of the MIND diet. But when you look at the Mediterranean diet, it's essentially a scoring system. You get a high score for eating vegetables, fruits, whole grains, nuts and seeds, legumes, beans, lots of it. Mono and polyunsaturated fats, not all fats are bad. Mono and polyunsaturated fats are great. And a source of omega fats, whether it's from fish, from chia seeds, from flax seeds, from walnuts, from hemp seeds, it doesn't matter, but omega fats derived from plant-based foods are better. And they get low score for eating sources of saturated fats, which come from meat, poultry, and dairy. Of course, meat has some other compounds that could contribute to inflammatory changes and oxidation as well. But mostly the saturated fat is the essential part that lowers the score in the Mediterranean diet construct, and any source of saturated fat for that matter. So when they consume this kind of a dietary pattern and scored on the higher side, they significantly reduce their risk of Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementia, including Parkinson's dementia and vascular dementia as well. As far as supplements are concerned, everybody wants a quick fix nowadays, but as far as research is concerned, we now know that we have to pay a lot of attention to at least 3 of these micronutrients. Vitamin B12, which is easily received through taking a supplement. Not, plant-based people who eat a plant-based diet are not the only ones who have low vitamin B12. Unfortunately, 41% of the population are low in vitamin B12. And as we age, the absorption of vitamin B12 becomes a little more difficult. So it's important to keep an eye on it. Not necessarily take it, but just keep an eye on it and make sure that we know what our levels are. Similarly with vitamin D, but if you're out in the sun, that shouldn't be a problem. And omega-3 fatty acids that are derived from nuts and seeds, and in situations where people need it more, based on our research, during early in life and late in life, algae-based DHA supplementation can be very helpful. For other micronutrients, it's best to derive them from foods rather than supplements. So what does the best dietary pattern look like for brain health? It's essentially unprocessed plant-based foods, or at least plant-forward dietary patterns. Consumption of mono and polyunsaturated fats are great, and these come from nuts and seeds and extra virgin olive oil. Plant proteins derived from lentils, beans, and soy products. Complex carbohydrates in the form of vegetables, whole grains, root vegetables like potatoes and things of that nature. Focusing on increasing fiber. We are deficient in fiber, and fiber is so important for creating the right kind of chemicals in our gut that helps the gut and the brain as well. And like I said earlier, extra virgin olive oil as primary cooking oil for food. We created a 7 rule for eating your way to a super healthy brain. And we mentioned this in one of our books. And the first one is eating a plant-based or a plant-predominant diet every day, avoiding foods that are high in saturated fats, avoiding refined carbohydrates and sugar. And this includes white rice, white pasta, and things of that nature, reducing salt and seasoning our foods with herbs and spices, and avoiding processed foods, drinking water, and eating homemade meals. And healthy foods don't need to look boring. This is a lentil burger, and it's beautiful and colorful. And as you can see from the Blue Zone's kitchen, these are my pictures, but as you can see in the books that Dan has produced, healthy foods can be exciting and absolutely delicious. All right. So let's move on to exercise. So what do we know as far as exercise is concerned? In the Framingham longitudinal study, a daily brisk walk resulted in 40% lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease later in life. 53% risk reduction with diet, and 40% risk reduction with just a daily brisk walk. Isn't that incredible? And we are all concerned about what we need to do, but if we just took care of those 2 things, we can significantly reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So from all of the studies and from the data that we have, we now know that regular moderate to strenuous activity grows the brain. So people who stay active actually have bigger brains. Sedentary behavior nullifies the benefit of strenuous exercise, which means that if you say, for example, you go for a run in the morning, or you go to the gym, and then for the rest of the day you're sitting behind a desk, it's not gonna work. You basically have nullified the benefit of all that physical activity. So staying active throughout the day and walking and getting those 10,000 steps is incredibly important. Leg strength is associated with a bigger brain. There have been studies which shows that when you have more muscle mass because you're physically active, you actually have a bigger brain, especially the part of the brain that is responsible for encoding memory, the hippocampus. Engaging in strength training at least twice a week, if you can, and engaging in vigorous cardio exercises at least 3 to 4 times a week, or at least walking on a regular basis, and having that continuity, the continuity of exercise and physical activity in doses that are needed for the brain to create more connections between its brain cells, or the concept of neuroplasticity. That's what it essentially means. When we stay active, our body creates these hormones, specifically one hormone that's called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It essentially increases the connections between brain cells. And the more connections we have, the more resilience we have, and the less chance of developing Alzheimer's disease. So that's exercise. Stress, that in itself is a huge topic, but we now know that not all stress is bad. There's good stress and bad stress. Good stress is the type of stress that boosts new cell connections and it sharpens your memory. It speeds learning. It creates brain resilience. It actually forces your brain to stay active and keep the connections alive between the neurons. Good stress is something like having a conversation with a friend, or public speaking, or volunteering, or going back to school, or playing a musical instrument, or taking on a hobby seriously and really working towards it. Those are the type of stress that you want, but it has to be real life. Yes, video games are great, puzzles are great, word finding, the little puzzles are amazing, but they're very myopic and they only activate a particular part of our brain. But when we do real life activities, multiple parts of the brain get activated, and it can result in neuroplasticity and resilience. And that's what the research has shown, that more real life activities are better than these small little games that only focus on, say, for example, improving your math or your language or your visual spatial. Something that involves all of them is much better. And of course, reducing bad stress. Bad stress are the types of stresses that are not under our control, that have been imposed on us, that essentially just create this very consistent, constant source of high cortisol and epinephrine that causes damage to our brain cells, especially the hippocampus, where the memories are processed. It impairs motivation. It actually reduces our energy levels. It impairs our learning. And it can, over time, with inflammation and oxidation, can cause damage, physical damage to our blood vessels and the supporting structures of the brain. So reducing bad stress, whether it's delegating it or delaying it, or essentially changing our lives in a way where we have better control over these elements, is very important. Again, this is a very extensive topic and it's outside the scope of this conversation, but very important. Sleep. Sleep is critical. For a long time, we thought sleep was, just something as a paraphenomenon, but now we know that it's central for brain health. Two very important things happen when we sleep. Cleansing of the brain happens through a very developed janitorial system called the glymphatic system, and it only gets activated when we go through the deeper stages of sleep. And the second thing that happens is memory consolidation and organization. It's as if you gain a lot of information during the day, but all of that information is scattered. But when you go through the deeper stages of sleep, this information gets organized into a file, folder, and cabinet, and it's easier for you to retrieve it the next day. That happens during sleep. And they've done, research on people who have been sleep deprived, and they actually scored lower in a test compared to those who weren't sleep deprived. So it's very, very important to keep good control on our sleeping patterns. This is what a sleep architecture looks like. So we go through multiple cycles of sleep, 4 to 5 of them, and we essentially go through 4 stages of sleep. REM, or the rapid eye movement, stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Stage 3, or the N3 as depicted in this figure, is the stage where most of the memory consolidation and cleansing occur. And they occur during the first half of our sleep cycle. Of course, with age, this changes. Our deeper stages of sleep get shortened, but the amount of sleep, the number of hours of sleep doesn't change. We all need at least 7 to 8 hours, at least 7 hours of deep restorative sleep, as much as we can. All right, sleep hygiene is a very extensive topic, but here are some of the important elements to remember. It's critical for us to create a ritual, which means going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time. Sleeping in silence and in the dark with no noise in the background. If you want some white noise, that's fine, but preferably not having any noise so that the brain can rest. Lowering the temperature helps. Eating at least 2 hours before sleep, because even if your stomach is not making any noise, the metabolism will keep you up. Not smoking or drinking alcohol right before bedtime. Taking a walk in the morning to set our biological clock, and also regulate the secretion of melatonin that will actually help us get better sleep later at night. Not drinking caffeine in the afternoon, because it has a half hour of 8 hours. So if you drink coffee 8 hours prior to going to bed, you will still have, half of that caffeine in your system by the time you go to bed. So making sure that you drink your caffeine or coffee earlier during the day in the morning. No electrical appliances in sleeping areas because of the blue light keeping us awake. And parking our thoughts outside of our mind by writing them in a journal before sleep. This points towards the importance of cognitive behavioral therapy. How do we stop our running thoughts when we hit the pillow? And that's an extensive topic as well, but there's so many things that one can do to have that under control. And then always for optimize or engaging mentally and cognitively. A very wonderful study was the nun study that showed the lives of nuns who dedicated their minds, their brains, and their bodies for research. And they had brain autopsies done when they passed away. And the scientists collected a lot of information during their life. And they found that the nuns who had high linguistic abilities, which means that they kept a diary, they kept on learning new words, they were very socially active with their tribe, with their community members, and they spoke, compared to those who were kind of withdrawn and not really engaged with anyone. Those that were highly engaged, they didn't show any evidence of Alzheimer's disease despite having abundant lesions of Alzheimer's in their brains, which is amazing. So despite the fact that they had amyloid and tau tangles in their brain, which are the two proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease, they never manifested the disease. Why? Because they actually created a lot of connections and brain resilience. That's the concept of brain reserve. It's like a bank account that you put money in throughout your life so you can use it on a rainy day. And if we keep our minds active, whether it's through school, but not necessarily school, speaking with friends, keeping engaged, having a very purpose-driven life, that actually will help us a lot. And coming to the last figure, we see these intersecting, circles. So the three elements that essentially contribute to better cognitive reserve is complexity of our lives or of our jobs. The more complex it is, the more good stress you introduce, the more protected you are. Challenge, because sometimes things that are complex can get very easy, but continuously challenging ourselves and moving the bar so that we continuously grow is critically important. You probably will, you may be a good pianist, but after a few years of playing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, it's going to be easy for you. So what do you do to keep yourself challenged? You'll have to probably learn something else. So that's the concept of challenge, of moving the bar. And all of that means nothing without having purpose in life. And it sounds like a soft concept, but I think it's one of the most critical aspects of brain health, because it provides a vector, a direction for our actions towards a main goal. And so making sure that we include complexity, challenge, and a purpose-driven life in whatever aspect it is critically important for brain health. These are our books, The Alzheimer's Solution and The 30-Day Alzheimer's Solution. And we are the Brain Docs on social media, and we'd be happy to stay connected with you. But I just wanted to come here and share the importance of lifestyle on brain health and how we can actually have more control on this incredibly devastating disease. I'm a neurologist. I see patients with Alzheimer's disease in my clinic and in the hospital all the time. And it's horrible. And some of you who have witnessed it, there's really not much that is being offered for them. But it is something that is under our control. And I hope that with this conversation, you can get a picture, you can get an understanding of what's important for brain health. That's all from me. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a wonderful day. And I hope you all live a wonderful, brain healthy life. Much love to all.